If you have the impression my voice is a little nasally or stuffy in this video, that's probably a fact, and it's due to the fact that I'm recovering from a pretty bad cold, so I still can actually hardly hear myself as I speak, so I hope things come through decently, or at least listenable. And today I have an interesting video, or at least what I hope will be an interesting video for all of you. We're going to look at this small sword in a little more detail, and believe me, this is an actual small sword. So many times a small sword is a bit of a tricky name because you get the feeling they may be really petite swords, but sometimes they exceed a meter in length. This one, however, is actually your stereotypical small sword. It does not even reach 80 centimeters, so I think it's about 79.3. And it's interesting because it's a small sword of the cut steel variety. So we're going to take advantage of this sword to also kind of discuss cut steel and why it's an interesting and very specific kind of technology, at least when it comes to swords. And the first question we may want to answer is, what exactly is cut steel? So cut steel is the technique of creating these faceted and really shiny steel surfaces which decorate a bunch of different objects, including swords. But it is also, in a sense, the product of that technology. So cut steel are these little beads you see here, for example. And I feel this is very interesting because lots of times I feel, especially as a novice, if you hear cut steel, you may be thinking about some kind of technology that refers to how the blade was produced, for example, or the grip. But we're mostly referring to the decorative style of the hilt, which refers again to this heavily beaded and very shiny, usually, trend. Now, this trend was in place both because it was a cheap way to obtain shiny surfaces, which were trendy at the time, but also it connects to interesting political and war-connected events around the end of the, well, or around the second half of the 18th century. So, for instance, a lot of French nobles were, well, if not forced, you could say, heavily motivated to turn in their jewellery or precious metals to support the costs of the 7-Year War. And while in many cases you could get away with hiding jewelry, the only way to show off a little or to still be able to fulfill certain fashion requirements of the time was, in lack of gold or silver, to cover yourself head to toe in cut steel jewelry. Another big product was, as I mentioned, shoe buckles, for instance. So these became a huge trend, especially in France. And a lot of these were imported from England, by the way. So England was actually one of the top producers of cut steel. Another interesting tidbit of information, I think, regarding cut steel is that it was such a big industry that when export to France ceased during, well, before, I mean, relationships between England and France were never perhaps necessarily great, but they started worsening before and around the Revolution era, and then especially later on with Napoleon. And the industry lobbied with English royalty so that actually cut steel was made an obligation to be worn at the English court. This as far as I was able to read. So and perhaps its use on swords also kind of connects with this time when the easier, perhaps, production of buckles and buttons that were being sold by the ton in France was drying up. Suddenly you needed to find new ways to apply this technology if you wanted to keep the market or the industry alive. Anyway, the point that interests us in this intersection between new technologies, trends, fashions, war, and politics is that for a rather brief period, so normally we're talking between the late 18th century and I think 1810, more or less, we have a trend of cut steel small swords. You will find these in a lot of variants, of course. Most of these were custom made. There still exist some patterns in form of document, of course. Patterns that were published in catalogs, for instance, and you could kind of order a pre-existing model of cut steel sword. But the vast majority of these swords were custom jobs. So this makes it relatively hard to be able to determine exactly provenance or origin of a given cut steel sword, because their presence was ubiquitous. They were produced in very high quality in England, for example, but as far as I know, also Naples had perhaps the highest quality of cut steel swords, although I presume a lower volume. But they were also produced in France and in other areas of Europe. So in lack of, let's say, patterns or shapes that are distinctive of a country or region, it can be a little bit difficult to pinpoint where a specific cut steel sword is from. However, we can at least usually narrow their location in time quite precisely to that period between the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, let's say. So with that introduction, I hope it was interesting. We'll get a look at the details of this sword. So we'll start exactly from the hilt, although the blade also has some interesting things we'll look at in a moment. So if we look at the whole assembly, it's completely made of steel. So even the grip itself is not meant to be wrapped or covered in leather or wire or anything. And speaking of the grip, we can see it is rather simple in its shape. Not to say it's unpleasant or not elegant, I think it's actually very beautiful. But compared to certain other cut steel hilts, which are basically covered in these little studs, you see this one is a little more minimalistic. What's really nice here, though, is this kind of fluting you see on the two sides of the grip here, and they kind of widen here in the center where you see a flower motif with these faceted studs. You kind of see there the little facets. You have to imagine these would have been obviously polished to shine. You see a couple of them are missing in a few points. This is going to be a recurring issue on the sword, but it's also interesting because it gives us an idea of how these were mounted in place. So these were kind of riveted into these holes and fixed in place. Of course, over time, some come off. Moving to the pommel, we see it has this urn shape. This is not infrequent. Actually, I would go ahead and say it's actually very common on these cut steel hilts. This one's kind of funny, actually, because it almost looks like a smiling face, almost like a clown face. You have the eyes, the nose, and the mouth there. It's a little less visible here because the studs are still in the sockets where the eyes would be. However, we see again the repeated floral motif, again on the two sides, so it's kind of a, it doesn't go all round, let's say. You have the sides of the hilt structure are more simple, and then the two flat sections are the ones that are decorated. You see the faceted motif recurring again here on the tip, here on the nipple where the blade is pinned in place. And the same motif here on this collar section for the pommel. As for the tang, if you're interested, we'll try and get a good angle of it. We can see it's pinned in place here, so you see straight through the tang there. Moving on to the crossguard section, I think this is a very beautiful part of this hilt assembly. You see these very wide quillins, wide at least for the size of the hilt here. And they're very delicate and narrow, actually. And they end again in this flower motif that seems to be the general theme of the hilt here. These, however, are slightly less decorated, so they don't have the studs all over. They only have one central one here. Another interesting feature you'll see here is this little loop. This is where the chain would have been fixed. So a lot of these swords, in place of a proper knuckle guard, would have had a more of an aesthetic statement. So it wouldn't have been obviously functionally practical, but the knuckle guard would have been substituted with a chain, again, studded with these cut steel studs. And this would have fixed here, most likely, where you see this little hole here would have been another loop, I suppose, or somehow would have been a means to fix the chain in place. In many of these swords, unfortunately, the chain, which is the most delicate part, is obviously gone, so that's perhaps not surprising here as well. Moving on to the guard, we see that the side facing the blade is rather plain, but it gives a good idea of how cut steel was assembled. You would have a base plate, which is this, rather thinnish metal, I would say. And on this, you see basically the back end of the different little riveted sections of each stud. So the more beautiful section, for obvious reasons, would have been the side that would have been visible even when the sword was sheathed. And this would have been completely studded in these cut steel elements. You can see a few are missing here, but overall you can get a good idea of how the sword would have looked when being carried. And before we move on to the blade, I just want to quickly call your attention to these small horns, you could say. These are vestigial remains of what it would be the finger rings that you would see on older versions of small swords. So earlier small swords, similarly to what you see with rapiers, would have had usable finger rings to help grip the sword in specific ways for the style of combat at the time. Obviously, as the need for the sword in combat declined, perhaps, and as the sword became more of a status symbol, but also as techniques changed as well, the finger rings were not necessary anymore, at least to the extent they were in the past. They still remained as a design element, let's say, but of course, as you can see here, they're not usable anymore. This, of course, also means that the space needed in between the quillin section, so the quillin block here, kind of gets squeezed down because there's no need for all that room to fit your finger in anymore. So you see this is way more compressed than you would see on older small swords. And this can be a helpful way to date a small sword, or at least roughly date it or estimate if it's a earlier one or a later one. Moving on to the blade. As I mentioned, it's quite short, but nevertheless quite interesting. We'll start with its section. You see it starts off with a rather flattened hexagonal section. So we have 3 facets or 3 faces per side. And as we move up in the blade, we see that central flattened face kind of develops into a mid-ridge. And this mid-ridge continues up to the tip. The tip I find quite interesting, actually, because you may think that such a short blade is a sign of it having been shortened or adapted. But I get the feeling that that is not the case here. So actually, if you look at it edgewise, you actually see it thickens here towards the tip. It almost feels like it's reinforced tip in a sense. And I wonder why that may have been done. So this is either a imprecision in the making of the blade, but that would seem really strange because, as we'll see in just a moment, the blade is a Solingen blade, most likely, so it should have a high quality of manufacturing. Obviously, this wasn't made for armor piercing, but it does make me wonder whether who commissioned or bought this blade was looking for something that would actually be able to be used without breaking or damaging, rather than a purely aesthetic statement. If you feel this blade, it is rather beefy, so here I'm holding it at about 1/3 of its length here, and it has barely any flex here. Actually, it's more like 40%, I would say. And even when I move towards the tip, you'll see it has some flex, but it is definitely not a bendy blade. This is quite stiff, and this would go through clothing and people fairly easily, I would say, if needed. The last point I want to mention here is why I identify this, or why I suppose it may be a Solingen blade, and it's due to the remains here of the decoration. The decoration is in line with what you would see, or at least what you can make out of the remaining decoration. Aligns very well with what we know of Solingen decorations. Here you see the remains of a trophy. So you see a flag here, a pike or something, and this kind of vertical line that runs through this way is very typical in Solingen blades. I actually see it a little better here. It's more like a branch decoration that runs vertically here. There's not much to say, unfortunately, about the rest of the decoration, but another element that kind of gives it away, possibly as a Solingen blade, is this decorative element here at the base of the blade. You can hardly make it out, but if you have seen one, you can kind of interpret what it is. Usually you'll have, I've seen it called cartouche, and you'll have like a checkered pattern or something with some kind of decoration here towards the end of the blade. So you see some remains of that. This is these kinds of decorations are typical of Solingen blades. So So yeah, definitely a decent quality blade, I would say. Well, and that is what it certainly feels. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon in another sword video. Bye.